The winter I am about to recall did not arrive on horseback like the others. It crept in on its knees, whispering through the cracks of the world, as though it meant to listen to every sorrow before claiming it. Snow pressed against the Whitlock cabin with the patience of a verdict, whitening the roof, silencing the chimney, and sealing a young widow inside with her labor pains and her memories. Eliza Mae Whitlock had always moved through the town of Bramble Ridge as if apologizing for the space she occupied. When her husband was alive, that gentleness passed for virtue. When he died beneath the spook mare the previous spring, it hardened into something the townsfolk mistook for weakness. By December, they spoke her name only when they needed an example of what not to become. A woman alone, a mouth without a man to justify its hunger. That night the wind pushed against her door like a creditor. She bent over the small iron bed, breath breaking into shards, one hand gripping the quilt her husband had stitched from old work shirts. The fire had collapsed into a dull red eye. Each contraction arrived like a question she could not answer. Still she whispered to the empty room, to the ghosts of better days, to the life inside her that refused to wait for kinder weather. The first child came with a cry so thin it seemed borrowed from a storm. Eliza wrapped the tiny body in the sleeve of her husband's coat and pressed her cheek to the infant's damp hair, memorizing warmth before the cold could steal it. When the second child followed, quieter but more insistent in her breathing, Eliza laughed, an astonished, broken sound that startled even her. 2 daughters, 2 heartbeats where the town had expected none. She named them Lark and Wren because birds, unlike people, did not ask permission to survive. By dawn the blizzard had settled into a relentless hush. Eliza's strength drained away with the last of her tears. The midwife, Ruth Calder, arrived late, her boots carrying the reluctance of someone who had argued with herself all night. She did what was necessary with efficient hands and careful silence, but her eyes kept drifting toward the door as though the town might be standing there, waiting to see whether compassion had betrayed them. "You'll need supplies," Ruth said at last, not meeting Eliza's gaze. I'll see what can be spared." The promise hung between them like frost. Both women knew the arithmetic of Bramble Ridge. Winter stores were counted in sacks, not in mercy, and mercy for a widow with 2 daughters was considered a poor investment. When Ruth left, she closed the door gently, as if tenderness could compensate for what she would not say aloud. Eliza did not venture into town for 3 days. Hunger makes its own calendar, measured in the shrinking of bread, the thinning of milk, the ache that settles behind the ribs like a quiet animal. She melted snow for water, rationed beans into portions that would have embarrassed her in better seasons, and sang to the twins with a voice that trembled less from fear than from the effort to remain hopeful. The songs were not for nourishment but for memory. She wanted Lark and Wren to know that their first days were not defined by silence. Beyond the cabin, Bramble Ridge carried on with its rituals of warmth. Smoke rose confidently from chimneys. The saloon windows glowed amber at dusk. Inside, Martha Kincaid presided over conversations the way a preacher presides over sin, her words polished by certainty. 2 girls, she said, stirring her cider. In a winter like this, best not to interfere with the Lord's intentions. The sheriff, Harold Pike, shifted in his chair, his badge catching the firelight without reflecting it. He said nothing, which in that room counted as agreement. Silence, like snow, accumulates until it becomes a barrier no one remembers building. By the 5th morning, Eliza's milk had begun to fail. She pressed the babies to her breast anyway, rocking them with a stubborn rhythm that belonged more to prayer than to comfort. The firewood dwindled to splinters. Frost threaded the inside of the window like lace no bride would wear. It was then she noticed the bundle outside her door. At first she thought the storm had deposited debris, some accidental offering of branches and cloth. But when she opened the door a blade of cold cut into her lungs, and she saw the careful stack of split logs, the small sack of beans tied with twine, the heel of bread wrapped in oilskin. No footprints remained. The snowfall had erased the giver's passage. Eliza did not call out. Gratitude, in such moments, becomes too large for sound. She carried the wood inside, one piece at a time, her breath leaving clouds that dissolved before they reached the ceiling. When the fire revived, it spoke in a language she had almost forgotten, pops and sighs, and the faint music of survival. That night she slept for the first time, without calculating how many hours remained before dawn. The gifts continued, never announced, never explained. A rabbit dressed and cleaned appeared on the step. A patch of canvas sealed the worst crack in the roof. Once, she found small tin of salve for the rash blooming on Wren's tiny hands. Each offering arrived with the discretion of snowfall, transforming the landscape without asking permission. Eliza began leaving half a biscuit on the stoop, an awkward tithe to an unseen benefactor. It felt foolish and sacred at once, like speaking to a star. On the edge of the property, beyond the skeletal remains of a fence, a man sometimes stood with his hat brim lowered against the light. Silas Boone had lived in Bramble Ridge longer than most, though few could say they knew him. He repaired what broke, accepted payment in whatever form was offered, and spoke only when silence would have caused harm. The town tolerated him the way it tolerated winter, inevitable, inconvenient, and rarely examined. He had noticed the Whitlock chimneys, failing breath long before he saw Eliza herself. He had watched the smoke thin to a thread, then disappear. He had told himself that intervention was not his habit, that solitude was a discipline he had chosen. Yet the image of a dark chimney during a storm lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. The first time he approached the cabin, he paused at the threshold as though it were a border between worlds. Inside he could hear the faint cadence of a woman singing, not loudly, not confidently, but with a persistence that made the air seem warmer than it was. He set the wood down and left before the song ended. Silas did not believe in gestures. He believed in continuance. A fence repaired today would still stand tomorrow. A roof patched before the storm would not require heroics afterward. Leaving supplies at the Whitlock cabin was not, in his mind, kindness. It was maintenance of a balance the town had chosen to ignore. Yet when he saw the biscuit on the step days later, wrapped clumsily in cloth, something within him shifted. Gratitude, like cruelty, has a way of multiplying when witnessed. The next time he returned, the door stood ajar. Wind had entered the room, scattering ash across the floor. Eliza lay slumped against the bed, one arm curved protectively around the twins, her face drained to the color of candle wax. For a moment Silas remained motionless, as though any sudden movement might confirm his worst fear. He closed the door first. Always, he began with the simplest repair. The fire came next, coaxed from embers with patient breath. He warmed water, softened beans, and waited until the steam filled the room before touching Eliza's shoulder. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition that someone, not the town, not fate, but a person, had intervened. He lifted a cup to her lips. She drank without speaking, the act itself a conversation. When she tried to rise, he shook his head once, a small refusal that carried more authority than any command. The twins stirred, their cries thin but steady. Silas adjusted the blanket, his hands moving with the awkward care of someone accustomed to tools rather than tenderness. He did not look directly at Eliza again. The intimacy of the room required a distance he could not name. Before she could form a question, he stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. Snow erased his departure as it had erased his arrival. Eliza sat by the rekindled fire, the cup still warm in her hands, and understood that survival was no longer a solitary act. She did not know the man's name, did not know his reasons, but she recognized the shape of his presence in the room. The mended hinge, the stacked wood, the careful way the beans had been measured to last 3 days rather than 1. Hope, when it returns, does not announce itself with trumpets. It settles into the body like heat after numbness, uncomfortable at first, then necessary. In town, the rumors thickened. Martha Kincaid had seen a figure near the Whitlock property, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who did not fear being watched. She carried this observation into every conversation, polishing it into accusation. "A drifter's taken up with her," she declared, her voice a bell that summoned agreement. "We cannot be expected to support that kind of arrangement." Sheriff Pike listened, his expression arranged into neutrality. The law, as he practiced it, concerned itself with theft and violence, not with the quieter injustices that left no bruises visible from a distance. He told himself that intervention would set a precedent the town could not afford. Ruth Calder heard these words and felt the weight of her earlier silence settle into something heavier than shame. She had held the twins, had felt their small fingers close around her own, had recognized in their breathing the same stubborn will that had carried generations through harsher winters. Yet she had returned to her warm kitchen and allowed fear to dictate her choices. Conscience, like frost, spreads if left unattended. She walked to the Whitlock cabin the following afternoon with a basket of linens and a jar of broth. Each step felt like an admission. When Eliza opened the door, her eyes widened not with resentment, but with a weary gratitude that made Ruth's apology catch in her throat. "I should have come sooner," Ruth said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more truth than any elaborate excuse. Eliza nodded. Forgiveness, in that moment, was less a moral decision than an exhaustion with carrying resentment alongside hunger. They spoke little. Words seemed extravagant in a room where every object had been earned through effort. Ruth examined the twins, pronounced them stronger, and left the broth on the table with instructions that were really hopes. As she departed, she noticed the fresh stack of wood, the repaired latch, the footprint pattern that suggested a man who approached only long enough to be useful. She understood then that someone had chosen to contradict the town's verdict, not with argument but with action. Evening descended with a softer light than the previous nights. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a sky the color of worn denim. Eliza sat by the fire with Lark asleep against her shoulder and Wren cradled in the crook of her arm. Outside, a figure paused at the edge of the yard, hat in hand as though acknowledging a boundary. She rose, slow and careful, and placed a biscuit on the step before retreating inside. When she returned to the window, the offering had vanished. The exchange contained no promises, no declarations, yet it altered the geometry of her solitude. Somewhere beyond the fence stood a man who had seen her at her weakest and had not turned away. Somewhere within herself grew the knowledge that survival was no longer an act of defiance performed for an indifferent sky, but a collaboration, fragile and unspoken. The fire burned steadily. The twins slept without whimpering, and for the first time since the storm began, Eliza allowed her eyes to close without calculating how much night remained. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but it no longer sounded like judgment. It sounded, instead, like the quiet footsteps of someone who had chosen to stay. Winter did not loosen its grip after that night, but it changed its temperament, as though it had been persuaded by a quiet argument no one else had heard. The cabin no longer looked abandoned from the road. Smoke rose each morning in a thin, determined ribbon. The fence stood upright, where it had once leaned in surrender. Survival had acquired rhythm. Silas Boone kept to that rhythm with the discipline of a man who trusted routine more than sentiment. He arrived at irregular hours, never close enough to suggest ownership, never distant enough to imply indifference. A snare reset, a hinge mended, a sack of flour placed precisely where snow would not bury it. Each action declared what his mouth did not, that neglect would not have the final word. Eliza learned the weight of his footsteps before she ever saw his face clearly. They were measured, unhurried, the gait of someone who had nothing to prove. She did not call out when he approached. Instead, she adjusted the twins' blankets, ensured the fire was worthy of witness, and left some small token at the threshold. Half a biscuit, a strip of dried apple, once even a scrap of fabric she had stitched into a handkerchief. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded and exchanged necessities. The town, however, found necessity less interesting than scandal. Martha Kincaid's observations sharpened with repetition. "He's there near daily," she informed anyone within earshot. No respectable man lingers at a widow's door without expectation. Expectation, in Bramble Ridge, was a currency traded more eagerly than compassion. Sheriff Harold Pike eventually rode out to the edge of the Whitlock property, his horse snorting steam into the brittle air. Silas was repairing the roof, his hands steady despite the wind. "You're making talk," Pike said, not dismounting. "Folk are uneasy." Silas glanced down only briefly. Uneasy about what? About impropriety. The word sounded rehearsed, as though Pike had practiced it on the ride over. Silas drove another nail before answering. "Impropriety is leaving a mother to freeze." The sheriff shifted in his saddle. The retort contained no heat, which made it harder to dismiss. Just keep distance, Pike muttered at last. Town's watching. Silas did not promise compliance. He finished the repair and descended the ladder without further comment. Watching, he understood, was the town's preferred substitute for acting. When he next approached the cabin, Eliza stood outside waiting, Lark bundled against her chest and Wren cradled in her arm. The sight halted him more effectively than any accusation. "You shouldn't bear their anger for me," she said quietly. Her voice had regained strength, though it still carried the echo of long hunger. "I can manage." The claim was not pride but protection. Silas removed his hat, exposing hair bleached by sun and years. For a moment he seemed to search for language and find it insufficient. Instead, he stepped forward and adjusted the blanket around Wren's shoulder, tucking it beneath her chin with careful fingers. The gesture was neither intimate nor distant. It was precise. "You are managing," he replied. "That's the point." It was the first time she had heard his voice, low, spare, as though words were tools he used only when necessary. The sound settled something restless inside her. Days lengthened by imperceptible degrees. The twins grew sturdier, their cries evolving into curious murmurs that filled the cabin with life. Eliza ventured into town for the first time since their birth, not to beg but to barter. She carried embroidered handkerchiefs, stitched during sleepless nights, and placed them on the counter of the general store. Conversations faltered when she entered. Martha Kincaid's eyes swept over the babies, measuring their health against her earlier predictions. "They seem to be surviving," Martha observed, her tone implying surprise rather than relief. Eliza met her gaze steadily. "Yes, ma'am, they are." The exchange altered the room's temperature. Ruth Calder stepped forward to purchase 2 handkerchiefs, her coins landing with deliberate clarity on the wood. Others followed, some out of guilt, others from curiosity. Eliza left with flour and dried beans earned rather than bestowed. Earning changes posture, yet scrutiny intensified. When Silas and Eliza were seen speaking near the well, no more than a few sentences about weather and wood supplies, the image traveled through Bramble Ridge faster than any storm. Rumor matured into accusation. One evening, as a new squall gathered beyond the hills, a small delegation appeared at the Whitlock door. Sheriff Pike, Martha Kincaid, and 2 ranch hands whose discomfort manifested as stern expressions. "You've made your point," Martha began without greeting. "The town has extended patience. But this arrangement—" "What arrangement?" Eliza asked. She stood straighter than she felt, Lark asleep against her shoulder. "This daily visitation. It's unseemly." Silas stepped from behind the cabin where he had been stacking wood. Snow caught in the brim of his hat. He did not position himself in front of Eliza, nor did he retreat. He simply occupied the space beside her. "I mend what's broken," he said evenly. "That's all." Martha's lips thinned. "You're encouraging dependence." Eliza felt the old humiliation rise like bile, but she swallowed it before it could dictate her expression. "Dependence," she replied, "is what you call mercy when it inconveniences you." The ranch hands exchanged uncertain glances. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat, his authority diluted by the wind. "This weather's turning," he said, as though that were the true emergency. "Best everyone see to their own." They departed with more bluster than conviction. The confrontation had not resolved the town's discomfort, but it had exposed its fragility. Judgment, when challenged without fury, often collapses under its own vagueness. That night the storm arrived with a violence that surpassed the earlier blizzard. Wind tore at shutters, and lightning fractured the sky into stark revelations. In town, a lantern overturned in the mercantile, igniting dry timber stacked too close to the stove. Flames climbed eagerly, consuming supplies the town had guarded so jealously. Bells clanged. Men shouted. Snow and fire wrestled in the streets. Silas heard the alarm from the Whitlock yard. Without hesitation, he secured the cabin door and turned toward town. "You'll stay?" Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'll come back," he said, and the certainty in his tone quieted her fear. He moved through the storm with deliberate urgency, not chasing heroism but preventing catastrophe. At the mercantile he organized bucket lines, directed men to dismantle adjacent awnings, and hauled crates of grain from the encroaching blaze. His silence, in the chaos, became a form of command. He wasted no breath on blame. Martha Kincaid stood at the edge of the firelight, her earlier certainty dissolving as she watched him drag a trapped ranch hand from a collapsing doorway. Sheriff Pike, soot streaking his jaw, followed Silas's lead without protest. By dawn the fire was contained, though not without loss. The mercantile's roof had caved in. Supplies lay charred and sodden in the snow. The town gathered, exhausted and chastened, around the blackened shell of its security. Silas did not linger for praise. He turned back toward the outskirts where smoke from the Whitlock cabin rose steady and unbroken. When he returned, Eliza was waiting outside despite the cold. The twins were swaddled and asleep, their breaths synchronized like a quiet duet. She studied his smoke-streaked coat, the fatigue etched around his eyes. "You saved them," she said. He considered the statement. "We saved what we could." The distinction mattered. Word of his actions spread more honestly than rumor ever had. Gratitude, unlike gossip, carried specifics. The ranch hand pulled from flame, the grain rescued before spoilage, the order restored without demand for recognition. The narrative of impropriety weakened beneath the weight of witnessed courage. Ruth Calder visited that afternoon, followed by others bearing small offerings, milk, cured meat, fresh-cut wood. Martha Kincaid arrived last, her composure recalibrated. "I misjudged," she said stiffly, addressing Eliza but glancing toward Silas. "The town owes you both." Apology, in Bramble Ridge, sounded unfamiliar, yet it rang clear. Eliza accepted the offerings without triumph. Vindication, she had learned, was less satisfying than stability. What she wanted was not the town's admiration, but its restraint. In the weeks that followed, assistance became less clandestine. Repairs to the Whitlock cabin were completed openly. Sheriff Pike organized a communal effort to reinforce the structure before the next storm. The transformation was not dramatic. It unfolded through work rather than proclamation. One evening, as winter finally began to thin, Silas remained after finishing a new set of shutters. The sun dipped low, staining the snow with amber light. Eliza stood beside him, the twins nestled in a shared cradle near the door. "You could have left," she said, not accusing but acknowledging, "when they turned against you." Silas leaned against the fence he had rebuilt months before. "Leaving is easy," he replied. "Staying is work." She studied him then without the veil of uncertainty. The man who had once been a silhouette at the edge of her yard had become the axis around which her fear no longer revolved. "I don't need saving," she said carefully. "I know," he answered. "You needed someone to stand where others wouldn't." The admission settled between them like the first true thaw. Lark stirred in her cradle, issuing a small, indignant cry. Silas crossed the yard and lifted her with an awkward tenderness that no longer felt borrowed. Wren followed, cradled against his other arm. The image would have startled the town months earlier. Now it felt inevitable. Smoke rose from the chimney in a confident column. The cabin, once a symbol of exile, had become a testament to persistence. Bramble Ridge still whispered at times. Habits die slowly, but its whispers no longer dictated survival. As dusk deepened, Eliza stepped closer to Silas, not out of dependence but recognition. The storm that had threatened to erase her had instead revealed the architecture of her strength, and the quiet man who had chosen to reinforce it. Winter would return in other years. Towns would falter again in their judgments, but the memory of that season would endure as proof that dignity can be rebuilt plank by plank, that mercy practiced consistently becomes transformation, and that sometimes the bravest defiance is not loud but steadfast. If you have ever stood at the edge of someone's hardship and wondered whether your small act would matter, remember this. Survival often begins with a single person who refuses to walk away. Stay where it is difficult. Mend what others ignore. And if this story has warmed a corner of your own winter, remain by the fire a little longer. There are more tales waiting to be told.